Okay, welcome back. Like I mentioned in lecture one, the digestive system is split up into an alimentary canal and the accessory organs. So in part one, we talked about the alimentary canal, which is basically one long tube from mouth to anus. That is where the food is passing through directly. The accessory organs of digestive system are going to be organs that are kind of situated around or within the alimentary canal that are going to dump substances into the alimentary canal to help digestion occur, that breakdown of macromolecules basically into micromolecules. So let's start with the mouth. So I had mentioned in lecture one that there are salivary glands in the mouth. So we eat food or even think about food, and the salivary glands are going to start working. There are three major salivary glands in the mouth. There's this one on the side of the cheek over here called the parotid gland. It sits just anterior to the ear. And if you've had 215, this muscle here is the masseter. So it kind of sits behind that as well. The one here, so part of the jawbone has been cut right here. So that would be your jaw here. There is a gland that sits just underneath that. So here on both sides, that's going to be called your submandibular gland. Your mandible is your lower jawbone. So sub means below that. So submandibular gland, that's going to excrete its substances into the mouth from underneath. And then there's a salivary gland that sits right underneath the tongue, and that's called the sublingual gland. Sublingual means tongue, so sublingual would be below the tongue. So those are your three major salivary glands. You have these two on both sides. These salivary glands are made up of a couple different types of cells. Your book goes into more detail, but basically these cells are going to secrete saliva, which is a watery substance with a bunch of enzymes in it, and also mucus. And one of the major enzymes in the salivary secretion is called salivary amylase. And when you see this amyl, AMYL prefix, that's going to indicate carbohydrates. So this is going to begin the chemical digestion of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates begin to be broken down in the mouth, but they will finish way down in the small intestine. We'll talk about that more in the physiology section. The salivary glands also secrete their substances to act as a buffer. So if you eat a really acidic food or something like that, it kind of buffs out that pH, moistens the food to help it go down easier, binds it all up together in a ball, also cleansing the mouth and the teeth after to keep those things kind of clean. And then I talked about the three types here of salivary glands that you have. The next accessory organ that I'm going to talk about is the pancreas. This is going to sit posterior to the stomach, nestled right into the beginning of the small intestine. So if your stomach was on this picture, it would be kind of here. Your stomach would be here. So the pancreas sits kind of underneath and behind that. And then here's your duodenum. This is the beginning of the small intestine. And your pancreas, if you can recall from the endocrine chapter, your pancreas has a lot of endocrine function, but it's also an exocrine gland actually as well. And the difference between endocrine and endocrine releases its substances into the bloodstream. Exocrine function secretes substances into a duct. And in the case of the digestive tract, we're going to focus mostly on the exocrine function, which is through a duct. So for endocrine, the pancreas released insulin and glucagon, which are hormones. For exocrine, it's going to release a lot of enzymes and bicarbonate. And so here's the pancreatic duct right here. It runs right through the pancreas. Here's the head of the pancreas here. Here's the body, and here's the tail out here. So this pancreatic duct is going to basically secrete enzymes this direction, and where it's going to dump those enzymes into is the small intestine. So here's something that really hits home about that accessory function is that the food is not entering the pancreas, but the food is here, right? Or what's left of it, right? In the small intestine. And the pancreas is dumping something into the alimentary canal to assist with digestion. And this is the duodenum, so this is the very beginning of the small intestine. Digestion completes here, but absorption also starts here. So I'm going to talk about in the physiology lecture what types of things are in this secretion, but it's going to be a lot of enzymes that are going to finish up the digestion of the macromolecules, as well as bicarbonate, which is going to be important for pH buffering. This duct enters the small intestine through a sphincter that's called the hepatopancreatic sphincter. Ampulla is just kind of a raised area, so there's kind of like a little bubble structure there where that duct kind of enters the wall of the duodenum, but it's controlled by a sphincter, a muscular opening, muscular controlled opening called the hepatopancreatic. Hepato means liver, pancreatic means pancreas. I'm going to talk about where this liver portion comes into play here in just a minute. But essentially, those things are going to be dumped into the duodenum here. Here's a close-up of that. If anybody's ever heard of the term ampulla of Vader, it's named after the person who discovered it. That is the same thing. All right, so the liver is another accessory organ that we have. The liver is a huge, huge, huge organ. From an anterior view here, you can see two lobes. So here's your right lobe, here's your left lobe, separated by a ligament called the falciform ligament. So the falciform ligament splits the right and the left lobes. An extension off that falciform ligament here is called the round ligament. And if you were to ever look at a human cadaver, this round ligament will actually go all the way down to the belly button. The round ligament is a remnant of the umbilical vein, which carried fetal blood into the mom's liver for detoxification, but obviously no longer needed in an adult. The coronary ligament sits on top of the liver here. The diaphragm would sit here as well. The diaphragm sits very snug to the liver, connected by this coronary ligament here. The gallbladder kind of tucks underneath the liver. They show this inferior view because this is kind of where everything is. There's a couple other lobes here that you can see under here. Caudate lobe being one of them, and then quadrate lobe up here, caudate, quadrate. We don't really focus on those a whole heck of a lot, but they're going to be on either side of this kind of hiatus right here. This is called porta hepatis. Porta hepatis. So porta hepatis is essentially where all of the lobes all meet, right? Here's a lobe, here's a lobe, here's a lobe, here's a lobe. And then also this is where all of the blood vessels and all of the ducts are going to enter and exit the liver. If we were to zoom in on the liver tissue, you would see smaller kind of chunks of liver that are called lobules. Inside those lobules are going to be hepatocytes, which are liver cells, a lot of blood vessels, and a lot of bile ducts. The liver has a lot of functions that I'm going to talk about next, mostly being detoxification of the bloodstream and then also producing bile for digestion. So if you can recall from blood vessels, we have the portal system entering the liver here. So this is the hepatic portal vein. So that's going to enter the liver. And if you can recall the different vessels that dump into that portal vein, it's going to be vessels from the intestines and the spleen and the stomach. So makes sense, right? Because anything that you're ingesting and it makes it to those areas of your body, alcohol, drugs, things like that, that blood needs to be filtered through the liver before it goes back to the heart to be pumped out again. We also have the hepatic artery, right? The liver needs oxygenated blood. And then back here, you have the inferior vena cava. All throughout the liver, we have all kinds of hepatic veins in here. So blood enters the hepatic portal vein, circulates through all of the hepatic veins of the liver, and then all of those hepatic veins are going to dump into the inferior vena cava and then go back to the heart. That's kind of the vasculature. Now, the liver also has a function in digestion, which is bile production. And we're going to have this kind of duct system in green. Here's the gallbladder. This is the cystic duct off of the gallbladder. The liver lobes have hepatic ducts. So there's a right and a left hepatic duct that come out of the left and right lobes. And then those are going to merge to form a common hepatic duct. That cystic duct is going to join up with the common hepatic duct and then form the common bile duct. I'm going to show you a different picture, and then I'm also going to draw it out for you, and it will make a lot more sense. But basically, the liver produces bile for digestion, as well as detoxing the blood. So also another liver function, don't forget that the liver also stores glucose as glycogen, and that glycogen is broken down into glucose upon low blood sugar. So if you can recall, glucagon and insulin hormones acting on the liver to do those things. It converts excess carbs to fat for storage, metabolizes proteins such as albumin, stores iron, some vitamins. It also cleanses the blood a little bit, and also forms bile. That's the major function for digestive system. So what is bile? Bile is a yellowish greenish liquid, and basically what happens, don't forget that, I'm trying to go through these steps here, skipping ahead. Don't forget what happens to red blood cells when they are old. And this comes from the blood lecture. Remember that hemoglobin is broken down. Hemoglobin is broken down into globin, which is a protein, and then also heme, which is broken down into iron and biliverdin. Biliverdin is that kind of pigmented waste, and that's converted into bilirubin. And bilirubin is going to be eliminated in urine. Bile salts also are going to come from here as well. So some of that goes into the small intestine as part of bile salt, and that will help the digestive process. Bile is necessary for the breakdown of fat. So up until now, we talked about carbohydrates are begun to be broken down in the mouth by salivary amylase enzyme. Proteins are, are begun to be broken down in the stomach by an enzyme that I didn't name yet, but it's called pepsin. Fats is the other macromolecule that has not been touched yet. Fat is not broken down until it gets into the small intestine. Now, again, the small intestine is primarily for absorption, but fat breakdown and absorption all occurs in the small intestine. And fat is a relatively large molecule, and so it needs to be broken down into smaller molecules before it can be absorbed and digested and chemically broken down even further. Bile is necessary for that to happen. The term emulsification is basically the breakdown of large fat globules into smaller fat globules. And then once that fat molecule is in smaller fat globules, then it can be broken down and utilized as fatty acids. So bile is necessary for that to happen, which is why all of these ducts are going to empty into the small intestine so that the small intestine can then do that. So the liver makes bile, and then it travels into the gallbladder, and the cystic duct off the gallbladder is like a two-way valve. And so it goes in there to be stored and then is dumped out into the small intestine when you have a meal. Gallbladder sits underneath the liver here. It has that cystic duct coming off of it in which bile can travel through. Again, we have left and right hepatic ducts. Bile is being formed in the liver, travels down, stored in the gallbladder, then it's all released into the common bile duct, and then goes down into the small intestine. I'll show you another picture in just a second. The bile is dumped into the small intestine through that hepatopancreatic sphincter. So this is where that hepato portion of that word comes from. We have secretions from not only the pancreas, but also the liver. Bile fills the bile duct at all times. So it always has bile in it ready to go, but we have a store here in the gallbladder at any given time. I'm going to go over this more in the physiology section, but essentially the presence of components in the duodenum stimulates the gallbladder to contract via some hormones. And then peristalsis in the duodenum. So when the body recognizes that there's peristalsis going on in the duodenum, that wave-like movement, then the pancreatic sphincter relaxes and releases those components into the small intestine. So it's kind of like telling the gallbladder, hey, there's contents down here. We need to dump some stuff into it. Clinical correlation, gallstones. So what are gallstones? Bile salts is mainly made up of cholesterol. So these are all cholesterol deposits, essentially. Here's your gallbladder with your cystic duct. It's kind of a sac. Cholecystitis, chole is gallbladder, cyst is cystic duct, and then itis is inflammation. So we have cholecystitis, which is inflammation of the gallbladder. Cholelithiasis is going to be gallstones. Lith is stone. Iasis would be like the formation of or presence of. And so gallstones, that's a fancy name for gallstones. Cholecystectomy is going to be the gallbladder and the cystic duct removed as a result of the excessive production of gallstones. Gallstones are very dangerous because once they're released into this bile duct system, they can get stuck and lodged, and then the bile can back up and into the liver as well as the gallbladder, but it never makes it to the small intestine. And so digestion can be really inhibited because of that. Why do people with cholecystectomies or gallbladder removal need to follow a diet that is low in fat? So up until now, we've talked about the importance of bile is to emulsify fat. And so if that big fat globules cannot be broken down into smaller fat globules, they cannot be chemically broken down into fatty acids and absorbed. So people with cholecystectomies need to follow a diet that's low in fat. Now, why can people survive without a gallbladder? Let me go back here. I would like this picture, okay? Here's that duct system again. So I'm going to draw this out. There we go. See if I can get him to focus here. My goodness. Maybe. There we go. Oh, you know why? Because my blur is on. Hold on one second. Let me just fix that real quick. There we go. Okay, actually, I'm going to stop screen sharing. Then you can see this. Okay. So we have the liver. I'm not an artist, by the way. Here's my liver. The liver produces bile. And bile is made in little bile ducts that are all throughout the liver here. They kind of go with the hepatic vessels, the veins and things. Okay, so there is a right hepatic duct and a left hepatic duct that comes out of the liver. Those two things join to form what we call the common hepatic duct. Okay, now we have gallbladder over here. The gallbladder stores bile. Okay. And it has a duct coming off of it called the cystic duct. The common bile duct joins up with the cystic duct. So now we have bile coming here. We also have bile coming here. And so that's all going to drain down a common tube called the common bile duct. Okay, so we have bile coming out the liver. We have our stored bile coming out the gallbladder, but it's all going to end up in this common bile duct. So why can people who have their gallbladder removed still eat fat to some extent? the liver's still making bile. Now, we don't have a store of it though. So the liver can only produce bile so fast that it cannot emulsify large amounts of fat because it can't keep up. And so that's why people with their gallbladder removed need to eat a diet low in fat, because their liver can only keep up so fast with forming new bile. Now, that common bile duct is going to come down here. Over here, we have our little pancreas. Remember, our pancreas has a duct coming through it, and it's got a bunch of enzymes in it and bicarb. And that pancreatic duct is going to join up with the common bile duct. And we have our small intestine coming through here. This is the duodenum. And these things are going to dump their contents. So we are going to dump bile, and we're going to dump enzymes and bicarb into the duodenum through that hepatopancreatic sphincter. Now, if we were to draw this, this is very stretched out of what the anatomy actually looks like. But this is easier to visualize than the actual anatomy. But if we were to draw in like the stomach in here as well, the stomach would kind of sit here, okay, kind of over that pancreas, because remember that the stomach dumps into the duodenum. So as soon as contents from the stomach dump into the duodenum, that triggers this hepatopancreatic sphincter to open. And then bile and enzymes can come in and get to work on those substances coming from the stomach. Okay, so I show you that because this picture is essentially what I just drew. So the liver would be up here. Here's your right and left hepatic duct, your common hepatic duct, your gallbladder with your cystic duct dumping in, and then that common bile duct coming all the way down. And then the pancreatic duct also dumping in into the small intestine right here. Okay, so with that, that is the end of part 2. And in part 3, we're going to dig into a lot of the physiology.